Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, my name is Perez Gratz. I'm the vocalist, cellist of Grayceon.
And how would you describe the music of Grayceon?
I would describe it as a very intimate but heavy album of our new work that we wrote over the course of the last couple of years. And we tracked it actually in January, so it's been a really quick turnover. We've been very anxious to get it in the hands of our listeners.
So that's actually a fairly fairly common question, I imagine, asking you what kind of music you make. I noticed that you guys get lumped into progressive metal, avant-garde metal, stuff like that. How do you feel about all those terms?
Yeah, well, you noticed that when you asked me, I kind of was a little stumped. I don't mind any of those descriptions, but it can be all of those things and it can be none of those things. There's not really a genre that you can pinpoint on it. And we're not really trying to fit in a certain genre. So I don't mind any of those descriptions. Yeah.
And I think really the key to people, or maybe the confusion around what kind of music you make, comes down to the fact that it's a heavy rock band with a cellist, which I think a lot of people don't really know what to make of that.
Yeah, and it's a power trio too, right? So it's just the three of us, but then we don't have a bass. We have the cello instead, but the cello doesn't play the same role as a bass would play in a trio. We always joke like it's metal, but to people that like metal, we're not heavy enough. But to people that don't like metal, we're like way too metal. So you can't win, you know.
So I should also point out that you've worked with the band Amber Asylum, and if people aren't familiar with Grayceon or Amber Asylum, they've probably heard your session work with bands like Neurosis, Agalot, Cattle Decapitation, a lot of the bands from the Bay Area and in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, and Amber Asylum's another band that is kind of hard to pigeonhole in that way, genre-wise. And Amber Asylum was always thrown into the metal scene. Like we were on a sub-label of Relapse, and we always played metal shows with other metal bands. But to just take us out of that context of the Bay Area metal scene and just listen to an Amber Asylum song, it doesn't sound metal at all. But it still has that same kind of darkness and heaviness. So, yeah.
Now, how do you feel about that? Do you like playing to a largely metal and heavy rock audience, or would you rather that your music maybe had a wider or reached a different audience?
I don't have a preference. I mean, I love metal, and I love our colleagues and comrades in the metal scene in the Bay Area. So I love playing shows with our friends that are also playing metal. The audience, whoever wants to listen and whoever likes us is fine by me. I think that in Amber Asylum, it was hard playing to metalheads because we were very quiet and delicate on stage. And so you could hear any kind of like talking or cash registers or what have you, like happening while we were performing on stage. And that is very hard just mentally. And sometimes we get that when Grayceon is playing kind of quieter moments on stage. So if you're playing to a different audience that is not necessarily expecting to hear really loud music, they may be a little more, I don't want to say respectful, but they may be just a little more conscious about, making noise as an audience member.
There have been bands like, My Dying Bride, for example, or even the first At the Gates album, where, there was definitely a role for classical instruments in those bands. But I think metalheads are used to the violin coming in at an interlude or during an intro or something like that, and not necessarily a whole song or even like a whole, set's worth of classical instrumentation.
Yeah, they've been used typically in heavy music as a way to sort of set the scene or set a vibe, or play one melancholy melody in one place or another. And yeah, in Grayceon, it's definitely only one of two melodic instruments and only one of three instruments total. And we all kind of just take turns playing solo, or we sometimes joke like we're soloing on top of each other like the whole time. And I'm not sure there are any other bands that really use classical instruments in that way. But yeah, that's kind of what makes us different.
One last thing about Amber Asylum, and then we'll move on. But to me, it was always an interesting argument because not argument, but I would hold Amber Asylum as an example of a metal band that doesn't use metal instruments. Like if the stereotype of metal is, guitars and drums being played really fast or, really slow or whatever, you could take any Amber Asylum song and transpose the music to, a typically rock instrumentation, and it would be incredibly heavy music. And it kind of came down to the almost philosophical question of, what is metal? Is metal just the instruments, or is it the actual like notes and instrumentation and song structure that makes a song metal?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a conglomeration of all those things, right? I mean, I get asked a lot, just like, what's my favorite classical, or how did I jump from, being in a classical realm to being in metal? And the same question could kind of be asked in reverse, right? Like, there are some classical composers where you listen to it and it's so metal, not because of the instrumentation, obviously, but just because of the riffs, So I don't know, maybe metal is a feeling, or metal is I don't know, a vibe that you can put into your music making, into your melodies, into your riffs, and it doesn't necessarily have to be guitar and drums. At least I hope it doesn't have to be.
So let's go to that question that you got asked. How did you jump from playing cello to playing in a lot of heavy metal bands?
I would have to say that, I mean, not to keep going back to Amber Asylum, but Amber Asylum was definitely my sort of gateway drug into metal in the Bay Area. Both my parents are classical musicians, so I started playing cello when I was really young, and it was kind of all I knew growing up in terms of just thinking that's what you did. You reach a certain age and then you pick out what classical instrument you want to play, because that's all I saw and was involved with as a young person. And then playing with Amber Asylum, that was my first adventure in playing in a band and performing in a band context. I had performed a lot prior to that in orchestras and small ensembles, playing in quartets at weddings, that kind of thing. But Amber Asylum, because we were so embraced by the metal scene, I got a lot of exposure into just the metal scene here and playing with a lot of metal bands, metal venues. And Chris Force of Amber Asylum was very good friends with several of the guys in Neurosis. And that was Neurosis was the first band that I played in as a guest outside of Amber Asylum. And then from there, I just kept getting asked to do strings in metal projects. And I really liked listening to metal. So it seemed like a sort of natural progression to play heavier music. And I originally picked up the bass and tried to teach myself bass, but I would get very frustrated very quickly because I couldn't play the things that I had in my head. So at a certain point, I just said, screw it. I'm going to just play the cello, because I'm already pretty, accomplished at that instrument, and I can execute the things that I want to write.
So that's actually really interesting to me that I'm assuming when you're saying that you tried to play the bass, this was for Grayceon?
Yeah, it was before Grayceon formed. But when I kind of knew that I wanted to play heavier music, I had a spell of trying to teach myself how to play bass. I did play bass, electric bass, in a jazz band when I was in 6th grade for like a year. And like, I don't remember any of it. I have a picture to prove that it happened, but I don't, the bass is actually pretty different than the cello. Like, the strings aren't the same, and they're not even the same, number of notes apart. They're in fourths instead of fifths. And I mean, obviously, like, I could be more agile with my left hand, more so than someone just picking up a string instrument for the first time. But yeah, it was a very different instrument. So I kind of gave up on it, sadly.
Prior to Amber Asylum and working with bands like Neurosis, did you have much exposure to heavy music?
I did a little bit. My sister is 2 years older than me. So some of the music she was listening to, I would get involved in. But yeah, not really until I graduated high school and started playing in Amber Asylum did I really get interested in metal. When I was in high school, I was really into like alternative music, which nowadays is a term that's kind of strange to use. But back in those days, in the late 80s and early 90s, alternative meant, Jane's Addiction and grunge, Nirvana, those kinds of bands was what I was listening to in high school.
So let's talk about the origins of Grayceon. At what point did you decide that you wanted to stick with the cello and integrate the cello into heavier music?
I had actually been thinking about playing heavier music before Max and Zach approached me to play in Grayceon. So I had been in Amber Asylum, but also trying to teach myself bass with an idea that I would, try to form or try to be a part of a heavier project, like a metal project. And then, I was really big fans of Max and Zach's thrash band Walkin', and they were also big fans of Amber Asylum. So we would see each other at each other's shows, and we were fans of each other's bands, and we became friends. And what I didn't realize at the time was Zach's first instrument is drums. He played bass in Walkin', but his first instrument was drums. And he and Max would jam with Zach on drums and Max on guitar. And they had all these riffs. They'd jam all the time. And they had all these riffs. And they had decided that they wanted to ask me to be in their band on cello. And one New Year's Eve party, they asked me. And I was like, well, what riffs are you guys working on? Will you guys just make me a recording or give me a recording? And so of course I'm thinking like a cassette tape of a practice. So they're like, yeah, we'll get you a recording. I just was interested in what the riff sounded like. And they came back like a month and a half later with like a full blown like demo that they had like gone into the studio and recorded. And it was pretty awesome. I was like, wow, okay, you guys are serious. You one, like have a lot of riffs you're already forming into songs. And two, you really want me to be in your band because I just asked to hear some of the riffs, and they basically presented me with this demo so that I would get excited about it and join.
Now, was it tricky trying to integrate your style or your instrument into what they had written?
No, not really. I mean, I would say that the vocals were the hardest. Writing against the riffs was super fun and challenging because Max's writing style is unique. He does a lot of interesting tempos and a lot of quick changes between riffs. And oftentimes, especially in the earlier songs that we were writing, not a lot of repetition of riffs. Like we just kind of start going and then the riffs would keep changing and we just keep moving forward. We'd very rarely go back to another riff. So that was really fun to write to. But vocals is a whole nother story. That is very challenging to do, especially when the riffs don't repeat and the riffs are kind of complicated and mixed up, quiet riff right up against a heavier riff. But we've developed the vocals over, the last 12 years or however long we've been a band, 14 years now. So I think the vocals play more of a hand in actually helping arrange the song now, as opposed to before where we were just writing the music and then adding the vocals on top.